Natural disasters, and in particular hurricanes, highlight the crisis of American identity and what it means to be an American. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria, and Hurricane Harvey have exemplified the disparity in the dispersal of aid and support between those who are archetypal Americans, white, middle-class professionals, and those who do not fit this outdated narrative of the ideal American, people of colour, people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and people from unincorporated territories. Those affected by Hurricane Harvey were attended to quickly, their homes were fixed and rebuilt, their lives were largely uninterrupted, compared to those affected by Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria. People affected by Hurricane Katrina and Maria were subject to exodus, a prolonged lack of sanitation, power and healthcare, and a vacuum of support from the federal government and the nation as a whole.
Yeah. The difference between Hurricane Harvey, Katrina and Maria, the citizens involved. Hurricane Harvey hit a region defined by their wealth, business and quality of life. Hurricane Katrina and Maria, however, devastated areas that were home to those who were not poster boy Americans. This visual essay seeks to explore the differences in treatment of those affected by Hurricanes Harvey, Katrina and Maria, and to understand why the narrative of American identity remains so institutionalized, unchanged and detrimental to the lives of those who do not currently fit the idea of what an American should be.
So let's start with defining American identity. Samuel P. Huntington's Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity defines identity as an individual's or group's sense of self. It is a product of self-consciousness that I or we possess distinct qualities as an entity that differentiates me from you and us from them. Identities are imagined selves. They are what we think we are and what we want to be. Huntington traces America's own mainstream identity as being Anglo-Protestant due to Americans' origins. This celebrated the importance of individual responsibility, which later manifested itself into the idea of the self-made man, with work ethic becoming a huge part of American culture and identity. Huntington also emphasizes the importance that Christian religion has played in shaping American identity, as well as fierce patriotism. We see in popular culture what it means to be a typical American. We've all seen the poster image of the mainstream American family, the heterosexual Christian nuclear family, God-fearing, hard-working, and law-abiding. The American image from the earlier decades of the 20th century, the golden years, many think of when uttering the phrase, "Make America Great Again."
But then, who hasn't been historically considered American? Huntington's chapter on assimilation praises those who have assimilated to America's Anglo-Protestant culture, who have lived by the Protestant ethic to be self-reliant, hard-working, and morally upright. He paints those who do not assimilate as a threat to American identity and culture, a way of thinking that we've seen a lot in the recent years. This does not only apply to immigrants, but to American-born citizens who do not fit the ideals of a stereotypical American identity, namely Puerto Ricans and African Americans.
Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War meant that following 400 years of rule, the colonial power conceded control of Puerto Rico, and the island became an unincorporated US territory in 1900. In 1917, the Jones-Shafforth Act granted all Puerto Ricans US citizenship. This act also transformed Puerto Rico's government, creating executive, judicial, and legislative branches, a Senate and House of Representatives. US laws were also extended to the island. This act, however, ensured that US maintained fiscal, legal, and governmental control over Puerto Rico. It exempted Puerto Ricans from voting in federal elections, including the presidential election, and it did not secure Puerto Ricans' constitutional rights. This left Puerto Rico in a limbo between sovereignty and statehood.
A case in which Puerto Rico's status as an incorporated territory proved to be problematic for its citizens was Balzac versus Puerto Rico. Jesus Balzac was prosecuted for criminal libel in the District Court of Puerto Rico in 1922. Balzac was denied trial by jury since this misdemeanor case was not eligible for a jury in accordance with the Code of Criminal Procedure of Puerto Rico. Balzac claimed that his rights as a US citizen had been violated under the Sixth Amendment to the US Constitution and appealed the decision. The US Supreme Court ruled against Balzac's appeal, citing that because the case concerned a Puerto Rican who was inhabiting the unincorporated territory, the provisions of the Constitution did not protect Balzac.
Balzac versus Puerto Rico is an exemplary case that highlights the issues relating to the status of a Puerto Rican. It proves that whilst they are US citizens in name, they are not always US citizens in practice. In 2017, a poll produced by Morning Consult found that only 54% of Americans knew that Puerto Ricans were US citizens. This is hugely significant when considering American identity in relation to natural disasters, because the poll goes on to discover that 8 in 10 Americans who knew Puerto Ricans were US citizens also supported the island receiving support and aid. Just 4 in 10 Americans who did not know that Puerto Ricans were US citizens supported the island receiving support aid. Puerto Ricans are not US citizens in the same way as a white, middle-class, American dream US citizen is. They do not possess the same rights, they are not equally represented in government, and they are not commonly perceived to be of the same status as a mainland American.
The societal distinctions of who is a true American is not only limited to those who live outside of its borders. The history of African Americans' relationship with both the federal government and white society has been unquestionably tragic and problematic. First and foremost, the institution of slavery and the denial by the government and society to recognise people of colour as people, never mind as citizens. Linda Kerber emphasises the conflict that has always been present in the narrative of the United States, stating, at its founding moments, the United States simultaneously dedicated itself to freedom and strengthened its system of racialized slavery. For example, it included the 3/5 Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution. Even after the abolition of slavery, at least in law, only after 1870 could people of African birth or even descent be naturalized. The oppression of African Americans was not just limited to political rights, but was integral to the class system of the United States. Kerber uses the example that when the state of New York lifted property requirements for suffrage for white men in 1825, only 16 free African Americans could meet the property level still required of them. As key political rights such as voting were only extended to those who owned property and citizenship, this was of course disproportionately white men. The African American population was systematically denied any form of representation even after the abolition of slavery. This is a system that continued throughout the next century and throughout the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Even in present-day society, African Americans continue to be discriminated against and misrepresented in law.
As a result of the continued inequality for African Americans, it is not surprising to see a sustained distrust in the federal government. In a system that has continuously prioritised its white citizens from misdemeanours to federal cases in court, why should African Americans trust it when it comes to protecting them from natural disasters or within the aftermath? This is a topic that is heavily explored by Jesmyn Ward in her novel Salvage the Bones. She criticises the way in which the evacuation procedure prior to Hurricane Katrina was geared towards those who had access, such as cars or money for public transport. For her protagonist's family, this was not possible, leaving her family to fend for themselves. Of course, every branch of the government acted in the wake of the storm to provide some sort of protection for its people. This included offering the Superdome Stadium as a place of shelter and summoning the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to provide food. However, they were heavily criticised because it was clear they had underestimated just how serious the situation was, as around 67% of New Orleans' population was black and almost 30% living under the poverty line. One of numerous critics pointed to the institutional racism and classism that they believed contribute to the lack of aid.
So, how do natural disasters such as hurricanes magnify issues within the American national identity? Of course, natural disasters are not conscious beings. They cannot specifically target a certain demographic of people. Many would argue that, whilst they are tragic for those involved, they are not a direct response to the society they affect. This is true to a certain extent. Yet, in the aftermath, both the federal and societal response to disasters can be scrutinised. It becomes clear who or what is a priority in the recovery process. Natural disasters provide a focused lens in which the core issues of a society are immediately exposed on a global scale. More specifically, the society's stance on race and class. Who is it in the rebuilding process that receives the most help or the fastest aid? Who is given the fastest medical treatment or sufficient financial compensation to rebuild their lives? Hurricanes not only destroy a place physically, but cause the everyday running of a society to break, illuminating any problems that society may have. To quote the study of James R. Elliott, after all, if the physical infrastructure of our communities cannot withstand such a catastrophe, how can the societal infrastructure that also gives them shape?
The three hurricanes were all widely significant in terms of their cost and number of fatalities. Hurricane Katrina and Harvey both cost $125 billion in damages, and Maria sat just behind, costing $91.6 billion. The number of fatalities caused by Hurricane Harvey was 89, Hurricane Katrina caused 1,833 deaths, and Hurricane Maria a huge 2,981.
Looking at the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Maria, and then Harvey, the same questions are raised with the responses both by the American government and by the national and global media. Why was it that in the cases of Katrina and Maria were the victims most affected of lower economic status and often in the non-white communities? Why was it that both the people of New Orleans and Puerto Rico were forced to leave where they were and move to other states? Crucially, why was this not the same for those affected by Hurricane Harvey, which hit a predominantly white, wealthier area of Texas. The depictions by the media of the victims of Katrina and Maria as refugees suggest that they are not already part of the country, but rather imply that they are outsiders seeking help instead of American citizens. If this was a general feeling, then surely they should have received sufficient government support. This was not the case. Instead, many were waiting long periods of time to secure housing and jobs and move homes. On the contrary, the area affected by Hurricane Harvey was rebuilt quickly and efficiently, allowing the residents to resume normal life fairly quickly.
So, are the unequal and lacklustre responses by the American government and media motivated by class or by race? Many journalists were quick to point out the unfairness behind tiny towns in Texas receiving more aid for Hurricane Harvey than nearby cities with larger minority populations. In an investigation by the National Public Radio's Robert Benincasa and Rebecca Hersher, it is shown that the federal aid is not often given to those who need it most. Instead, it is given to those with other safety nets. Hersher gives an example of low-interest loans, stating the federal government gives low-interest loans to help families who, let's say, have lost all their belongings in a flood. But you have to have a certain credit score to qualify, and that's to protect the taxpayer, because if you don't pay your money back, we all do. Often people who have more money have been able to maintain higher credit scores.
This means that those in lower income households, often minority populations who were largely affected in New Orleans, were left without credit to rebuild their lives and homes. When directly compared to the victims of Hurricane Harvey, the rebuilding process was often covered by insurance or the banks deemed them reliable to lend money to, solely based on their credit score. Sociologist Hugh Gladwin and Walter Peacock's analysis of Hurricane Andrew determines a pattern in the social response to natural disasters, even prior to Hurricane Katrina. Their study states that class played a more vital role in the failings of the evacuation process over other factors such as race. They concluded that whilst ethnic minorities were less likely to evacuate than Anglos, it was probably as a result of economic conditions rather than race or ethnicity. In other words, race matters, but through more proximate or direct factors associated with class resources. This sentiment is echoed by sociologist William Julius Wilson. He argues that by the 1970s, the status of Black Americans was as a result of the economic resources and class, rather than race. He cites a historic shift in the number of social and political developments, for example, declines in white bigotry, the Civil Rights Act, affirmative action, all which now allow a growing number of blacks to pursue and attain professional middle-class status. However, it has produced the unintended consequence of a poor black underclass. The plight of this new underclass, Wilson argues, is not a contemporaneous fiction of racial antipathy, but rather a function of concentrated poverty that operates through a host of non-racialized mechanisms, from underfunded school districts to ineffective job networks to inappropriate role models.
The federal response to Katrina in 2005 seems to suggest a lack of preparation to this disaster, despite the American South being well known for experiencing hurricanes. The response to Harvey over a decade later, however, was far more efficient. A report on the efficiency of the government in the rescue operation states that over time the United States and its emergency response mechanisms have evolved. This was partly through lessons learned through previous crisis response operations, but also due to innovations. In a direct comparison of Harvey and Katrina, the report states that responders were mobilized more effectively and efficiently, mainly because plans were in place before the hurricane struck. The main criticism for Katrina was that the US officials did not have plans regarding how to respond, how to coordinate, and how to use skilled responders. Hence, several problems were experienced with respect to search and rescue, logistics, relief, delivery, and also recovery. Furthermore, during Katrina, FEMA seemed almost unwilling to accept help from non-government organizations. For example, the American Red Cross was not allowed into New Orleans following the disaster and was unable to supplement the government's response. Several articles can be found that criticize the response to Hurricane Katrina for lack of efficiency, effectiveness, and coordination, which apparently improved a lot in response to Hurricane Harvey. For instance, the number of rescue people in the aftermath of Harvey was more than 72,000, whilst it was about 34,000 in Katrina. Having also hit a wealthy business area, this could have been a motive for the faster, more efficient response to Hurricane Harvey.
But the same cannot be said for Maria and Puerto Rico. The federal response to the relief effort for the Puerto Ricans can be summed up most eloquently by the American Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump, throwing the toilet roll into the crowd to show that Americans were indeed helping them recover from this disaster. As comical and unbelievable as this may seem, it is typical of the reaction that was extended to the victims in the wake of Hurricane Maria. Images and reports of the island, even a year after the hurricane hit, show a nation without power, food, and sufficient aid from the American government, who they are under the protection of.
This would suggest a racial element to the recovery process after the natural disaster on behalf of the federal government. James Elliott and Jeremy Pace, in their study of Hurricane Katrina, extend this to the way in which different races respond themselves to the catastrophe. Elliott states that research continues to show that while white bigotry and overt discrimination may be on the decline, close friendships, neighbourhoods, churches and social clubs remain highly segregated by race. This is important for understanding human response to natural disasters, because people respond to disasters not as isolated individuals, but as members of those overlapping forms of social affiliation, which interpret, affirm and support particular definitions and responses to the situation. Crucially, he goes on to argue that these links and reactions are not only limited to the family, but also influence extra local networks called upon in a time of crisis.
Considering this all, why is it that, despite natural disasters highlighting the unjust treatment of people of colour or people from low socioeconomic areas and people from unincorporated territories, discourse surrounding American identity has remained so stagnant? Why is the archetypal American still white, still middle class, still self-made and still suburban?
Well, firstly, urgency is committed to those who are viewed as valuable members of society, and these people are those who meet the criteria set forth for the archetypal American. Non-Hispanic white workers make up 77% of newsroom employees. That's reporters, editors, photographers and videographers. They are 78% of congressmen. They are 88% of lawyers. Non-Hispanic white people control American policies, laws, economics, relations, headlines, and overall image. To commit aid, resources, and urgency to these people is to see that the narrative of the US is a nation defined by stability maintained as long as those who are in control are kept content, well treated, and are largely undisturbed by natural disasters, as seen through the quick recovery of Houston's wealthiest areas following Hurricane Harvey.
Secondly, the people of New Orleans and Puerto Rico who were affected by Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria have suppressed voices. Tainted by their lower levels of education, lower household income, and lower likelihood to be in a professional occupation, they lack the time, resources, and knowledge to challenge the American system's reaction to natural disasters, which, in turn, sees the same discrimination against these groups in time of need continue. The archetypal American, on the other hand, is defined by their attainment of a degree from a prestigious university, their white-collar job, their investments and savings, and their ability to challenge a system that does not meet their needs. To prevent the system from being challenged, the educated, the wealthy, and the professionals are held first during times of natural disasters to avoid any uproar. This continues a cycle of privilege. Those who have voices are held first, which leaves their lives uninterrupted and their voices still strong. Those with suppressed voices, however, are last on the list to be helped. This leads to a high chance of having their homes, wealth, and even lives taken away from them, and therefore a further suppression of their voices as they are plunged further into poverty.
Finally, discourse on American identity and who constitutes being an American remains unchanged due to the underrepresentation of the suffering of vulnerable and minority people. Donald Trump reported the fatalities of Hurricane Maria as 6 to 18 deaths. The real number is much closer to 3,000. Hurricane Harvey caused 88 deaths. Donald Trump had no issue with this number. He simply spoke of the efforts committed to Hurricane Harvey and celebrated the giving of aid and rescue operations. With Donald Trump, the most powerful figure in the US, downplaying the loss of lives in Hurricane Maria and making it seem like they are significantly lower than those of Hurricane Harvey, he justifies the amount of aid he and his government spent on Hurricane Harvey, which far outweighed that of Hurricane Maria. With Hurricane Harvey topping the rankings as the most expensive hurricane ever, joint with Hurricane Katrina, we sympathise heavily with the citizens of Houston, and therefore we sympathise with the wealthy, the educated, and the privileged. Whilst the sympathy is necessary, these people were subject to natural disaster, that sympathy is not replicated within Puerto Rico, who allegedly experienced a lesser natural disaster. So, we continue to see those who reflect the archetypal American in our newspapers, on our television screens, and receiving our aid, and this only further consolidates that these are Americans and these are those who represent the American identity.
To conclude, the fast, effective, and overall superior aid distributed to those affected by Hurricane Harvey, in comparison to those affected by Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria, proves that the American identity, and more specifically who is an American, has remained unchanged. The historical narrative that a US citizen is a wealthy white professional, a self-made man, an achiever of the American dream, is still a very real narrative in contemporary America, and is proved by the disparity in governmental and wider national response to natural disasters affecting wealthy, whiter, and traditionally American places, and poorer, more diverse, and non-traditionally American places. This is a phenomenon that has remained unchallenged, and as the very same people who have the power to choose where aid and support go during times of natural disasters are the same people who get help first. When archetypal Americans help themselves, they only make their voices louder and suppress the voices of minorities harder, and with people of colour, poorer people, and citizens of unincorporated territories powerless, the dominant American identity remains unchanged.